Hello again, everybody. This is Mark Santangelo again, your professor for history, and we are here for part two of the lectures for March 24th, the last part of our agenda. It's called The Spanish Colonies in the New World, and we're going to be picking up the story after where we left off at the last one. So, remember from the last one that after initial contact, none of which really led to long-term trade or any kind of things like that in different parts of the world, following Columbus's accidental crazy voyage, then the rest of the world began to get some idea that there was something here, some people, some resources, some land. Because the Spanish were the ones who hired Columbus through sheer luck, really, on their part, they're going to be the ones who are going to be able to take advantage of that first. In fact, shortly after Columbus's first voyage, the Spanish and the Portuguese signed a treaty, which had been initially signed off on by the Pope, of all people, basically drawing a line down the middle of the world and giving the Portuguese the rights to things on one side and the Spanish the rights to things on the other side. This enshrined the fact that the Spanish were going to be exploring into and beyond where Columbus had been in the West Indies, and then farther into what's going to be North and South America. And on the other side, the Portuguese, who already were exploring and setting up colonies in Africa. And the way the line works, if you ever wondered why Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country, is because the line essentially was drawn in a way that later the Portuguese used that to justify colonizing that part of South America that sticks out because it goes past the line that was theirs. Can you think about that? Imagine the hubris, where you have the Pope and the leaders of two European countries drawing a line down the world and saying, you get this side, I get that side. Well, on that side, on the Spanish side, the Spanish did, in the decade or two following Columbus's initial voyages, begin to try to get a sense of what it was that they had encountered, since they had first dibs, at least according to the Pope. And of course, not according to the millions of people who live there already, but no one in Europe ever listens to them. And at first, after initial excitement, it seemed to a lot of the leaders in Spain that maybe this really wasn't going to be a big deal. Yes, there was land, there are islands, and eventually they realized there are even larger land masses, and that's all to the good, but they weren't really getting the valuable resources that would justify the huge expenses and the amount of time and labor that went into exploring and eventually trying to set up colonies in this other part of the world, which after the early 1500s they were realizing were new continents. So it took a little while for it to seem like this was going to be some kind of a jackpot that was going to really be to the tremendous benefit of the Spanish. And then that really all changed after 1519. The key guy here is a guy named Cortez. Um, Hernando Cortez and a group of explorers, settlers, conquistadors landed on the outskirts of the Aztec Empire, what's now Veracruz in Mexico, right on the coastal region there. And then over the next few months, basically, then worked their way inland to the center and capital region of the Aztec Empire, roughly coterminous with the modern country of Mexico. The Aztecs were, by the standards of the world, one of the most advanced technologically, militarily, scientifically civilizations really going in the entire world. Um, they were dominant in much of what is now the southern part of North America through Central America. Militarily dominant, they really were by the standards of the world in those days, even though the rest of the world had never heard of them prior to this. They were really, really a big deal. They were fierce. They were tough. You don't want to go up against the Aztecs in the 1500s, except for the fact that, unbeknownst to them, Cortez and his men had brought with them these invisible allies that they had no idea that they'd brought. I mentioned at the end of the last lecture this Columbian exchange, this passing of biology from one part of the world to the other. And at the beginning of that, I mentioned that disease was a key part of that story. Cortez had no idea, but he was being aided by the bacteria and other germs that he and his men had brought with them, and that other Europeans had brought a little bit before them that had circulated through this area. And so, although on the face of it, it should have been a fierce resistance that he and his men faced when they arrived and began to try to fight their way into the interior, much of Much of the population was devastated, especially a lot of the fighting age people. And so Cortez and his men were able to get to the capital city, Tenochtitlan, where they captured the emperor, who was also the god of the Aztecs. It's a nice job if you can get it, and held him for ransom. And the ransom that they're requesting is gold because they had seen some precious metals along the way. It turned out that the Aztecs, where they are located, are right where there is much of these precious metals available. In fact, I'm no geologist, but my recommendation to you, if you're looking for gold, silver, copper, or other precious metals, go to where the mountains are because that's where those things that are under farther beneath the surface, they are more easily accessible. So for centuries, the Aztecs had been digging out gold and these other precious metals and using them as a big part of their ceremonies, of their rituals, of their definition of wealth, and so it was available. And when Cortez demanded gold tribute in exchange for giving Montezuma back to the Aztecs, he received so much that in the end he decided that it'd be foolish for him to do anything other than to just take over. So, with very limited resistance, shockingly limited given the otherwise incredible strength of the Aztecs in any other context, um, Cortez and really just a few dozen, it's 100 or so guys in the end, are able to take control of the seat of the Aztec Empire, and then with reinforcements that came over from Spain in a very short period of time, essentially take over the entire area. The Aztecs were then were forced to work for the Spanish as slaves, and the once very proud Aztec Empire then collapsed tragically. But for the Spanish, this was the jackpot. This was exactly what they've been looking for. Their chance to make a killing, in this case, literally, on the New World. And from there, the idea of this being not a worthwhile mission, the idea that this would not be something that they would follow up on, there's no question. The Spanish Empire, from this point, is firmly entrenched. About a decade later, there was a similar experience where another conquistador named Francisco Pizarro traveled a little bit farther south, went into South America, and encountered and similarly took over the Incan Empire. The Incas are in the Andes and where modern day Peru is. Although there are precious metals there that are not gold, mostly silver and copper, nevertheless, an incredibly rich amount of these precious metals were available. And so, again, after Pizarro, his conquistador allies, and then eventually other Spaniards who arrived to fully entrench the colony there, after they defeated the Incas, they settled themselves there as a colony which was designed to extract as much of these mineral resources as possible and send them over to Spain. The survivors, the Incan survivors, and other Native American tribes of the area were essentially enslaved and forced to work for the Spanish, their conquerors, as labor force. And again, the Incan Empire, which had been large, vast, really, in terms of size, powerful technologically, probably in some ways scientifically more advanced than some of the European civilizations of the time. Nevertheless, they were defeated, as had the Aztecs been as well. And so, in a very short period of time, the Spaniards were able to get an incredible amount of rich territory that then they used as the jumping off point for what became really, for a time, the most powerful empire in the world. I should mention, in addition to having the allies, the invisible allies that they brought with them of the bacteria, the diseases that they brought with them. The conquistadors were also aided by the fact that, in addition to the fact that they were desperate to succeed and to conquer, and you can't necessarily argue with a guy who's fighting that hard for something that they want to fight for. These guys are tough, but they're also aided by the fact that they have with them weapons that no one in the Americas had ever seen before. Yes, by the standards of modern times, the weaponry that the Spanish brought with them were primitive at best. The guns and muskets that they're using, they have an effective range that you can be measured in yards. It's not always clear that they can even hit what they're aiming at unless it's standing someone right in front of them. It takes minutes to reload, and they can only fire once. Nevertheless, if you have a bunch of soldiers from either the Incas or the Aztecs who are advancing on a bunch of Spanish soldiers, who then fire into the crowd. It's loud, it's dangerous, there's an explosion essentially involved, and then somebody's going to get shot. Somebody is going to fall down, and that's obviously going to be terrifying, especially for someone who never seen it before. In addition, the Spanish soldiers brought with them horses, and there had been no horses anywhere in the Americas prior to the arrival of Europeans. Today we think of horses as cute. Today we think of, everybody, little kids want a pony. But horses actually, they're huge. They're big. They're powerful, muscular, and especially the military horses that the Spanish brought with them would have been absolutely terrifying to anyone who had not seen anything like this before. I would say it would be similar to us now if, if a dragon was attacking us, like in Game of Thrones or something like that. It was that much of a game changer. So all those together put the Spanish in a position where they were able to defeat these very proud, very powerful Native American empires, and then on the ashes of the defeated empires to instill themselves as colonial leaders. And they became incredibly powerful. No one had ever seen this kind of wealth or power before. The gold, the silver, the copper, and ultimately the things that are grown in some of the plantations that were established by the Spanish in this area as well brought back so much wealth that then the Spanish were then able to use to make them one of the dominant European countries of the time. Um, there was almost no economic understanding of even what to do with this kind of wealth. And the Spanish Empire really had more money to throw around than they knew what to do with for a while. Based out of those two areas, what is today Mexico, essentially the old Aztec Empire, and then the parts of South America that they grew out of from the old Incan Empire. Eventually, Spanish, at least in theory, on paper, the Spanish Empire became maybe the hugest in the world in terms of just square footage, square mileage. You're talking about comparing to Alexander the Great, and you're comparing to, the Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan in Asian history, but probably in terms of just on the map, the amount of square miles that the Spanish claimed at least to control and had the soldiery and administrative personnel to manage. Um, Impressive, huge, powerful, wealthy, and unprecedented, probably, because based on this colonial success and the conquering that they did. Um, Frequently, later countries who arrived on the scene blamed the Spanish for treating the land and the people very badly, um, as if to imply that they would have done things differently. I'm not convinced that any European power would have done anything other than do what the Spanish did when they saw the opportunity to get gold, to get wealth, and to defeat people who they saw as culturally inferior, even though in many ways they're on par, if not superior technologically, economically, scientifically, but didn't have the diseases to the on their side. So the Spanish Empire, which was huge, Spanish Empire, which was powerful, Spanish Empire, which was an American empire, is going to lead the Spanish to be the first who are going to have settlements across the invisible line, the line that really only exists in our head, um, that is going to eventually define the borders of the United States of America. Spanish settlers and conquerors and Spanish administrators in the years and decades that followed were hoping that they would have similar success and hit similar jackpots as Cortez and Pizarro had done. It's I guess fun to think about making your own million as opposed to sort of managing somebody else's. And so explorers and eventually colonists started to leave the key core areas of the New Spain, which was essentially the big name for most of their colonies, and to head out from there. So, early exploration of what's now the United States started in 1539. The governor of the Spanish territory on Cuba, a guy named De Soto, in 1539 led an expedition to explore the mainland area of what's now the American Southeast. And so De Soto led an expedition that left Cuba, crossed into American Southeast, and explored around some of the modern day southeastern states. Um, and he's the first European that we know of to get to some of those areas. He personally died, and then the rest of the people on the expedition went back to Cuba with maps of the territory that then led them to when they wanted to colonize later. That was sort of the first jumping off point. In the west, not long after De Soto's expedition, there was an expedition that came out of Mexico and headed north and wound up being the first Spanish exploration, the first full-on European exploration of what is now the American Southwest. The leader of this was Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. Coronado was following up on legends that he and other people in Mexico had heard from some of the Native Americans that somewhere to the north there was another civilization with incredible wealth. These sometimes they were told that there are 7 cities of gold. This tied into a Spanish legend, the cities of Cibola, and Coronado was sent on an expedition by the governor of New Spain down in what's now Mexico City to go see if there was any credence to these legends. There wasn't, although much later there will be gold found not far from the areas that Coronado was looking, but nobody knew it was there at the time. He just was following up on legends. So as a result, starting in 1540 and essentially for the next couple of years after that, Coronado and the other soldiers that he was with were the first Europeans to do any serious exploration into what is now the American Southwest. So they traveled through places like Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona. We believe Coronado was the first European to see the Grand Canyon. And then afterwards, when the Spanish decided that they wanted more permanent settlements there, again, they were able to follow the maps of this early exploration and these early journeys that on one side De Soto, on the other side Coronado had begun to cross into what someday would be the United States of America. On the Spanish maps, and really on the world maps, the entire of North America was Spanish controlled. It's something that they declared was theirs. That old treaty in 1494 said it was theirs. Other Europeans are going to show up and have other things to say about that, but they had the first crack at what will someday be the U.S. So skip ahead a generation, and after these early dipping the toe in the exploration of what will someday be the United States of America had been underway for a while, on both sides, the east coast and in the western area, the Spanish settlement began to establish colonies. The first and most important of these on the eastern side, from which will grow out Florida and eventually much of the southeastern of what's now the United States will be managed at least by the Spanish for a while. The first of these is in 1565. The colony of St. Augustine was established in 1565, again jumping off from Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. What was concerning the Spanish in the 1560s was that although on their maps and in their minds all of North America was theirs, there were other European explorers who had traveled along the coast. I mentioned Giovanni Caboto, John Cabot, had been farther up the coast on behalf of the English earlier, and there are other explorers who had done similar things along the coast for other European countries. And the Spanish said it was theirs, but who's listening to them? And what really concerned the Spanish in the middle 1500s was that some of these other European countries began to establish settlements, small, tiny little pinprick settlements along the coast. Specifically, their concern was that there were the beginnings of French settlements along the eastern seaboard. Mostly these were settlements of people who were fleeing the French government and looking for a place to go, similar, as we'll see later, to the Puritans who were going to be fleeing the English government in the 1600s. In the 1500s, there were French Protestants who were being treated very poorly by the French government, and they decided that they would take a shot at coming to the New World and establishing colonies for themselves there. Even though they weren't really on good terms with the French government, the Spanish government was very concerned about this because if they felt if they allowed any kind of foothold by any other country, in particular France, which is a big and to their mind dangerous country, then that would potentially grow into something that would challenge the Spanish right to control this entire territory. So St. Augustine was established in 1565 as a fort. And you can still go down to St. Augustine, Florida, and see the ruins and the remainders of this fort. It is the longest running European-based established settlement in the United States of America today, dating back to 1565 and continuing in existence since then. It's a military thing. There's government representatives there. There are military people there. And after they set up their fort, their first job was to travel up the East Coast and to essentially just destroy any other European colonies they found there. So those Huguenot colonies, the French Protestant colonies, they were eradicated by military expeditions from St. Augustine after the establishment of it in 1565. And that essentially was St. Augustine's job as it grew over the decades into the larger territory that today we think of as the state of Florida, some of which included places that aren't just Florida today. Um, Essentially, it was a military establishment. The job, as the Spanish government saw it, was for the St. Augustine fort and the Florida colony to be a buffer to protect the more valuable Caribbean and Mexican and ultimately South American colonies, where a lot of the real wealth that Spain was getting were from. They wanted to make sure that they had a military buffer to make sure that there would be no one else getting close who might be dangerous to their interests. And so the Spanish colony in the American Southeast was always kind of a backwater. It wasn't the kind of place where you would hope to get sent to if you were in the Spanish government or if you're in the Spanish military. It's the kind of place where you get sent to if you got in trouble with your boss, and they would send you over there, sort of on the outskirts. But it did continue to exist, and eventually there were plantations and other kinds of settlements there. But largely, it was there as a military umbrella for the more valuable stuff below. Out west, after Coronado's expedition in the 1540s, again, there were some similar other explorers and map making and stuff that was going on. By the very end of the 1500s, the Spanish government decided that they wanted to have a military and administrative presence out in the western part of that part of North America. And so in 1598, a governor was sent out of modern day Mexico into New Mexico, um, and they established a colony in a place that they called Santa Fe, which is now in modern day state of New Mexico. Santa Fe is named after St. Francis, established on his feast day. This colony was established as a Spanish administrative colony in the middle of a set of Native American tribal peoples that the early explorers had encountered dating back to the 1540s. These people actually ethnically different, speaking different languages, but as far as the Spanish were concerned, were pretty much all under the same picture as far as they are concerned because they looked the same and they lived in very similar ways. This is in the more deserty area of the American Southwest where it is very difficult to grow food. And over the centuries, dating back a couple of centuries before the Spanish arrived, there had been Native American civilizations that had established small scale villages where, for their own protection and then where they could get irrigation and grow some food. Um, there were tribes that lived nearby that would attack them, and so they built these fairly self-sufficient small villages to protect themselves from outside raiders. They're agricultural, and they basically kept to themselves. When the Spanish first arrived and saw that the architecture of these people were similar, even though their languages weren't all the same, spread out over the American Southwest, mostly in modern day Arizona and New Mexico, the Spanish named them in their own mind based on on what the architecture looked like. And so, to the Spanish, these people were the Pueblo people because of the villages that they had established essentially out of the limestone in this part of the American Southwest. Actually, a lot of the Pueblo people spoke different languages. Culturally, they didn't always have a lot in common, but they were, after 1598, they were ruled by the Spanish out of Santa Fe, and the Spanish saw them all as sort of all one, the same part of just a different team. So, um, the Spanish settlements in the American Southwest were even less of a place that somebody in the Spanish government wanted to go to. Not only is it more arid there, but it's very barren compared to the much more established parts of the Spanish settlements in places like Mexico City. This is very much on the fringe of Spanish control. And what happened in the American Southwest is that although slowly there was an increasing Spanish presence, it was always pretty fringe in the early decades after the establishment of Santa Fe in 1598. It was largely a military thing, and it was also a religious thing. So, um, we know a lot about the interaction between the Pueblo villagers and the various pueblos, as the Spanish called them in this area, and the Spanish colonists who began arriving in large numbers after 1598. And so provides us with a good test case of exactly what kind of interaction was going on between the Native Americans living already and the Spanish people who showed up and said, okay, we're in charge now. So far, certainly, the story of Spanish control has sounded pretty grim. Um, what I've talked about has been conquest. It has been the lust for power and greed. It has been about enslavement of the survivors of the Spanish conquering, and it hasn't been a very nice story. Um, I have to say that probably, as I said before, that story would be pretty much the same with small differences depending on who'd gotten there, but pretty similar. Um, but there are important differences, and we want to dig into some of the nuances. So let's get a better idea of what's going on because there's an interesting story here to tell. When the Spanish arrived in 1598 and established themselves and set themselves up in charge of this whole region with the different Pueblo villages, the Pueblo peoples, and it's peoples, there are multiples of them, um, the Pueblo peoples ultimately acquiesced to Spanish control largely kind of in a fatalistic way. They had heard of although they had no direct contact as far as we know with the Aztecs, they had heard of the Aztecs farther to the south, and they knew that those were fierce people who were not to be messed with. And they had further heard that the Spanish had beaten them. So therefore, when the Spanish showed up, it was clear that these were people who were quite serious and pretty fierce. But also, it became clear to the Pueblo villagers that although the Spanish were there to stay, and although the Spanish were planning on ruling, that their control over the day-to-day lives of the Pueblo villagers would be not as imposing as it was in other places in the Spanish Empire. There weren't any minerals to extract from the ground. There's very little growing that can go on there. And therefore, the Spanish who showed up in that area in fairly small numbers didn't have the same kind of force in their interaction with the Native American tribes. And many of the Pueblo villagers decided that, with certain exceptions, with certain limitations, that this was something that they could live with, as long as the Spanish also helped protect them from their ancestral enemies. There were these other nomadic tribes who would attack the Pueblo villages from time to time. The Spanish show up, they've got guns, they've got horses, they've got soldiers, and theoretically that would allow the Pueblo villagers a little bit more respite from these occasional attacks that now they hopefully wouldn't have to worry about. So, the Spanish control of this area was numerically not as strong and was not as forceful at first, which then seems that it gives us an idea that perhaps Spanish control doesn't necessarily have to be so brutal. Instead, although there were soldiers and there were administrative people for the government who were running the colony, the tone for the relationships between the various Pueblo villagers and the Spanish was largely set on a religious basis. I mentioned previously that Spain in 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella got their act together, that they had considered themselves to be the most important Catholic nation in all of Europe. And continuing through the period of the Spanish Empire, religion, Christianity, the Catholic Church, very important to the leadership, they considered one of their key missions, and I use that word specifically, one of their key missions was to bring Christianity, bring Catholicism to peoples who previously had not been exposed to it. From the culturally insensitive point of view of Europeans, and we live in more modern times where people are perhaps a little bit more willing to accept differences. Um, from those perceptions, the Spanish and more broadly the Christians of Europe believed that they were doing a service to the Native Americans by bringing them Christianity, even if in the process they were taking their lands, doing terrible things to them and getting them sick, enslaving them, and worse in some cases. In the mind of many of the Europeans, this trade off is something that they could live with. Whether the Native Americans could live with that, of course, is a different question. So the Europeans, when they arrived in a place like Santa Fe, religion was a key part of what they're doing. In this case, though, in New Mexico, broadly speaking, the American Southwest, run out of Santa Fe, in that area, almost all of the day-to-day interaction between the Spanish government and the Native American peoples of the villages, almost all of that was dominated by the priests. Specifically, the branch of Christianity that was running things in the missions of that area, in the Spanish area, in the colony, were Franciscans, friars who are descendant from the ideas of St. Francis of Assisi. The Franciscans, unlike other kinds of denominations, the Franciscans live very quietly. They live very modestly. They don't tend to spend a lot of money, which means that they don't extract a lot of money or tribute from the people that they live among. And so, if the Franciscans are going to set the tone, comparatively speaking, that meant that the Native Americans again might be able to live with this, or at least sort of accept these strangers in their midst. Certainly, they had to adjust to the fact that the Franciscans are trying to impose Christianity on the villages. The Pueblo villagers, the religion was generally based on, similar to what I talked about in the last lecture, a combination of ancestor worship and a worship of the natural forces around them. It's centered in a place inside each pueblo called the kiva, which is a sacred place where rituals would happen. Once the Spanish showed up, the solution that the Pueblo villagers had once their religions were outlawed was they moved the kiva out of the village and they moved it out into the middle of the desert nearby, and then they would sneak out and do their religious services there. Not a great trade-off, but something that they could deal with because they figured correctly that the Spanish are never going to wind up going out and finding the kivas in the middle of the desert. So the Franciscans' goal was to spread Christianity to the Pueblo villagers by living among them, by showing and demonstrating in their way of life that they were people to be trusted, that the ideas that they believed in were ideas that other people then could buy into. And they're trying to convert individual or family members at the same time and then bring all those converts into the church with them and then expand from there. And they had some success. Over the decades that followed the establishment of Santa Fe, there were a fairly large number over the generations that followed of Pueblo villagers who did become members of the Catholic Church, who did receive communion and baptism, and were considered by the Franciscans to be successfully converted Christians. What the Franciscans didn't really ever seem to understand was that a lot, not all, but a lot of the Native American people in the different Pueblo villages were not fully converted to Christianity, although they were baptized into the Catholic faith and went to church. Although that was still a big deal, and it required them to change their lives in important ways, many, maybe most, of the Christian converts that the Franciscans brought in to the Catholic Church in the different Pueblo villages continued to go and worship at the kiva, the sacred place of their ancestral religion, or at least were sympathetic to the people who did that. And really, the Franciscans were sort of halfway converting more people than they realized, which meant that they didn't necessarily have as many actual allies as they thought that they did. Now, the Franciscans set the cultural tone for the Spanish rule of this particular area. which means in many ways a moral tone. The Franciscans ensured that there were laws that were set up to enforce certain kinds of moral standards that they brought with them from Europe and that they brought out of their Catholic faith. One of these is an emphasis on the holy sacraments, particularly going to be a conflict here over the sacrament of marriage. Okay. Normally, when we're in class and we're talking about this, this is my chance to say, hey, everybody, wake up. This is where I'm going to talk about sex. I don't get to make eye contact with anybody now, but this is where we're going to talk about sex. So it turns out that the Franciscans, and more broadly speaking, the Spanish, but especially these Catholic missionaries, have a very different idea of gender and sexuality than the Native American peoples who they were trying to assimilate or bring into their church. Um, Traditionally, the understanding among the various Pueblo cultures of gender worked like this. The theory was that women and men were almost like two different kinds of creatures. Women were inherently responsible and inherently group oriented, focusing on making sure that important tasks got done. Men, however, were more like wild animals. Men were less likely to focus on important tasks, less likely to buckle down and get things done that needed to get done for them to be successful. Men were more likely to just go off and do stuff and not worry about the consequences. And therefore, sometimes that would create a conflict, especially when there were too many men who were going off and running around and doing dumb stuff. So, in such a case, if there was a guy who was acting in a way that was not socially useful, a guy in the community who was just not meeting his responsibilities, then the understanding was that it was up to a woman to show him why he needed to continue to be a part of the team. And so, what that would mean was that a woman would step forward and then she would go and take him and they would do the thing that humans do. And afterwards, the man would realize that he did indeed have something that made him want to continue to be a part of this community, to be a part of the overall good of the community and make sure it kept going. Um, Typically, in such a case, the man would give the woman a gift, and then but that would be that. Um, if it needed to happen more than once with different people or whatever, but eventually the guy would get the idea, at least for a while, and would calm down or buckle down to the work he needed to do. But there was no long-term string attached. There were no connections. It didn't lead to marriage. It didn't lead to anything. It's just a one-time event, and then after that, it's all over. Uh, the Franciscans got to Santa Fe and established the missions that they set up in the different villages, and they found out about this kind of behavior. And as far as they were concerned, this was sinful. As far as they were concerned, sex was something that should only happen between married couples. Sex is something that should happen for the propagation of the species, and nothing other than that. The idea of sex as pleasure, the idea of sex as sort of culturally valuable, none of that is something that they believe in. And the idea that there were men and women having sex out of wedlock and not even considering getting married afterwards, that to them was incredibly sinful. And therefore, in the early days of the New Mexico territory, uh, the Spanish government passed laws making it illegal for men and women to have sex out of wedlock. Well, one of the problems with passing laws is that you can pass a law, but it doesn't mean you can change a culture. You just made something illegal, which is what happened here. The men and the women of the Pueblo villages continued to engage in what was to them a culturally appropriate activity necessary to the success of each of the villages, and then they took their chances on what kind of punishment was going to come. And that punishment came. When they were caught or when somebody found out that this had happened and reported them to the authorities, maybe one of the assimilated tribes people, or maybe one of the Franciscans found out about it or just saw it, which happened, then the two offending people would be arrested and they might be publicly flogged or thrown in jail or whatever, which is, of course, going to lead to resentment on their part, but not necessarily change the behavior, other than maybe they're going to be a little bit more sneaky about it. But the overall sense among the Pueblo villagers that sex was something that should happen with no strings attached as part of the way to keep men and women both engaged in the same important activities in their town. That continued to happen. The Franciscans couldn't figure out what was going on here. As far as they're concerned, the laws are very clear. The behavior was sinful. They had made clear to, over and over again in the sermons and the Sunday services at Mass that this is something that Jesus would never approve of, God would never approve of. There's absolutely no way that any good Christian would ever engage in this sort of activity, and yet it kept on happening. They encouraged the leadership of the colony to crack down on the enforcement even more, and something at some point is going to give, because by the 1670s, the crackdown on what the Franciscans and the Spanish leadership of the colony considered to be licentious behavior was getting pretty fierce, and yet it wasn't as if the Native American people were changing their behavior at all. So there is going to be a crisis. And that crisis was exacerbated by the fact that it is always going to be difficult to live and grow food in this part of North America. And it is not unusual where there are going to be some bad years agriculturally, which is going to lead to some troubling times and starvation. There were several of those years in the late 1670s where there really wasn't enough food, where the food that was grown in the Pueblo villages really wasn't enough to sustain everybody. And the Spanish leaders, military officials and other officials, they took their share and then sort of left the villagers with whatever was left. At the same time, the other tribes who were not settled down, the nomads in the other parts of the region, began to attack the villages more often because they were having similar problems with food. And it turned out that the Spanish really were not doing a very good job of defending these Pueblo villages after all. All of which adds up to a sense among the people in the different villages, well, why do we have these Spanish people here anyway? They're trying to force us to change the way we live. They're taking our food at a time of starvation, and they're not defending us. What's the point? Like, why should we have allowed these people in? And around this time, in one of the villages, there was an important leader who emerged from the religious community in one of the Pueblo villages. His name is Pope, which is a weird coincidence because Pope is a religious leader who is opposed to the Catholic Church, and yet his name is spelled almost exactly the same as the ultimate leader of the Catholic Church over there in Rome. That's just a weird coincidence. Pope was what we would call a fundamentalist. He believed that the religious ideas of their society needed to be returned to their basic original ideas. And as far as he was concerned, the problems that they were having, not just the problems with the Spanish, but the overall problems with food and with outside conflict, all those problems were a sure sign that the Pueblo villagers were not living the way they were supposed to be living. That the old deal that they'd always made with the natural forces around them, that deal had been broken as soon as the Spanish showed up and began to try to impose changes on the Pueblo people's way of life. So Pope made very clear to his followers, the solution is that we should get rid of the Spanish, just boot them out, and then get rid of anything that they have given us or brought to us or forced upon us, including, especially, the Catholic Church. As far as Pope was concerned, eradicate any traces of Spanish control and Spanish settlement, and then things go back to better. His ideas are very powerful, and many of the villagers in the village that he lived in thought that he had a prescription for solving their problems, and he became one of the most powerful people in his community. The Spanish leaders of that community found out about what Pope was preaching, and they're very scared because they were convinced that this would lead to an uprising. Now, in a different context, one would imagine that Pope would have been arrested and possibly executed or something like that. But because Spanish control in this area was fairly weak, they weren't sure that they would be able to control the response if they had him arrested or executed. And so instead, the leaders of the local Spanish authorities, they had him essentially banished. They sent him from the village that he had grown up in, and send him over to another village way over on the other side of the colony. Their hope was that then, if he doesn't speak the same part of the language over there, and that would be the end of that. That was a mistake because it turned out that in the new village, that Pope was again able to communicate these ideas, found new followers, and in fact, within a short period of time, there were many people in all the different Pueblo villages who felt the same way that Pope and his followers felt, which was that the Spanish were causing their problems. The Spanish were trying to change them in ways that they were not going to accept, and therefore it was time to get rid of the Spanish. And in all the different Pueblo villages, there was a conspiracy that was worked out over a period of time where the plan was that on a particular day, all of the villagers in each of the villages were going to rise up at the same time against their Spanish rulers in each of the villages and then defeat them, boot them out, and that'd be the end of that. It turns out that actually the Spanish authorities found out about this revolt, but they were so weak, so limited, um, had such limited firepower that in the end, even though they knew about it, they were not able to put down the revolt. So, in 1680, the Pueblo villages rose up in revolt against Spanish control and were successful in killing many of the Spanish authorities and soldiers, booting out the rest of them and banishing them from the area of the American Southwest. They then afterwards burned down the churches and destroyed as many vestiges of Spanish rule as they could. This Pueblo revolt in 1680 is the most successful anti-colonial revolt anywhere in the Americas until the American Revolution, and it is the most successful Native American revolt against European colonization. It was successful to the point where it took 13 years for the Spanish to be able to regain control of the territory, which they're only able to do with a major military force, after which that military force stayed among the Pueblo villages because afterwards they were convinced that another revolt was going to happen at any time. Effectively, the Pueblo Revolt and then the counterfight against it that ended in 1693, the Pueblo Revolt also more or less set a northern cap to Spanish rule in the American Southwest. Although eventually the Spanish did establish colonies a little farther to the west along the Pacific coast in California, which was largely a mission territory where other friars tried to bring Christianity, as well as some agriculture. There's some haciendas and other kinds of agriculture going on there. Very limited. Although California is going to be part of Mexico all the way until the United States gets it in 1850, and therefore Spanish territory prior to that, still it's a fairly limited imprint. And in the rest of North America, the Spanish really never did anything other than explore a little bit farther past the American Southwest because they were scared of the Pueblos. They were scared that the Pueblo Indians and then other Native American tribes who might ally with them, if the Spanish got a little bit too far, then the Pueblo Indians would basically destroy them. And so, among other things, that kind of set a limit on how much of North America the Spanish ever really truly colonized. On their map, they claim the whole thing is theirs, but in reality, their footprint in North America is fairly limited. American Southeast, the area around Florida, largely military to try to defend the Caribbean from any outside attacks. And the American Southwest, which is barely even that, is more or less just a buffer zone to make sure that no Europeans are ever going to get too close to the valuable stuff, and then also these missions. Okay, that does mean that the rest of North America was eventually something that other Europeans could get into, and certainly they wanted to. The incredible wealth of the Spanish Empire led other European countries to desperately want to get in on the same kind of wealth that the Spanish had gotten. Clearly, no one else can take over the Aztecs or the Incas. The Spanish had gotten there first, had defeated them, and are extracting that gold and silver as fast as they possibly can. But the hope was, among other European countries, that maybe there are other parts of the Americas that similarly would bear fruit if they got in there as well. So this sort of comes in two waves. Most of the European countries sent explorers in the early days to try to figure out what was where, and a lot of those early explorations are trying to get a sense of how big the Americas are, and also is there a way to get through it? Because it seemed to them at first that the wealth would really be if they could do what Columbus was trying to do, which was to connect all the way to Asia. And then after that, there'd be a later wave of colonization as Europeans tried to set up colonies that they hoped would give them some, if not all, of the wealth and power that the Spanish had gotten from establishing their colonies. So, two that I want to mention, just focus on, but I can tell you almost every European country tried to set up colonies in the New World at some point, to the point where even Sweden had a new Sweden. That tells you everything you need to know. But the two I want to focus on are France and the Netherlands, both of which are going to be important to the history of what's going to be the United States, although in one case smaller than the other. So the French began to to explore North America as early as 1524. The French hired an Italian guy named Verrazano. If you've been to New York, he's got a bridge named after him, which connects Staten Island and the bottom of Brooklyn. We like to name our bridges after people that no one else has ever heard of before. But anyhow, Verrazano was hired by the French to explore around the East Coast, the Atlantic coast of North America. His specific goal was to figure out if there was a way to cut through it and get over to Asia, which he was not able to find. But as his secondary mission, he also was exploring and looking at the territory and looking for places that the French could maybe later take advantage of. So he's working for the French government, plants the French flag from time to time. I'm sure that the Native American people are wondering what the heck's going on there. There's some dude showing up and putting a pole in the ground with the three colors on it and then sails away. But later on, the French were going to use Verrazano's early explorations as justification for taking more land. Um, in the decades that followed, their explorations largely focused on the northern part of North America as they're exploring through the river network. They got into the interior through the St. Lawrence River, which then gives access to the Great Lakes interior, which today is an important, incredibly important area on the border between the U.S. and Canada. Rich territory for growing food and for fur-bearing animals, and ultimately that was the area that the French decided that when they felt that they wanted to take a shot at a colony, that was where they focused. So, a New France colony, and all these names are brilliant. I don't know how they came up with that name, but anyway, the New France colony was established in the early 1600s. Quebec is established in 1608 as one of the first French settlements, first colony established here in the New World. I actually have ancestors on the French side of my family that go back almost that far, who were there in the early days of the French colony in Quebec. And the French established a colony that based out of the Great Lakes region and then the Mississippi River that pretty much cuts North America in half, um, gave them, on paper at least, a very large colonial empire. The ultimate maps that they established of New France, it's a good chunk of what's today Canada, and it's a large chunk, in their minds at least, roughly half of what's now the United States of America. On paper, it actually looks not the same size as the overall New Spain, but something of some comparable value. But it was never really something you could compare to New Spain because the Spanish had found gold, the Spanish had found mineral wealth, the Spanish had therefore found incredible power. Um, the French really not the same kind of a thing. The French colonies, although had multiple administrative centers and had some mission aspects to them, there are Catholic priests who go with them to do some mission work, similar to what I just talked about for the Spanish. Um, and then there's some agricultural things. There are farms and things that they did to try to send food back to sell in Europe. Um, in many ways, the French colony was much smaller than it appeared compared to the amount of land that they claimed they controlled, because they entered into alliances with Native American tribes, and then the areas that those tribes lived in, the French sort of considered theirs as well, even though they really mostly kept to their villages and their trading ports. Um, the French colony, because because it never came up with the same kind of incredible mineral wealth that the Spanish did, the French colony was largely based on trade. Most of the important administrative centers for the French were trading centers or trading forts where Native American tribes would come from time to time and trade things that the Europeans wanted that didn't exist in Europe in exchange for products and goods that didn't exist in North America that the Europeans, the French, brought with them. Um, the idea of trade as the centerpiece of a relationship with the Native Americans already makes this a very different kind of a colony than New Spain or any other Spanish colonies. Those colonies were about taking things for the most part and bringing religion, but mostly taking things. New France is mostly about trade. And I will say that anyone who's done any analyses of New France uh, definitely understands that in any part of this trading partnership between the French and their Native American neighbors, the French always got the better of the deal. The value of the things that they were selling to the Native Americans in exchange for the raw materials they were getting from them, they're always getting the better part of the deal. They're going to turn it around and sell it, for a big profit back in Europe. But still, the idea of trade is certainly much closer to equality, much closer to some kind of partnership than what we saw with the Spanish. And as a result, the relationships between the French and their Native American neighbors were always much smoother than was the case for the Spanish and most of their neighbors. Some of the French settlers intermarried with Native Americans, took a Native American bride in some cases. That may have individually been culturally not that good, but in the long run, it's going to lead to breaking down of cultural barriers. That would be something that would help make these two groups of people interact with each other closer to terms of equality than you would see in most of the other colonial networks that we've talked about. Um, the French learned early on a crucially important cultural trope that was common throughout North America that other Europeans, the Spanish ignored it, and the English thought it was dumb. Um, there are a lot of different Native American tribes. And from one interaction to the next, from one year to the next, from 2 years ago or whatever, um, things can happen between those tribes that are unpredictable. And so, if you are at the crook of the river and you see on the other side of the river representatives, people from a tribe who you maybe haven't seen in a while, it's not always clear, like, well, these are friends or these are allies or these are enemies. Are we trading with them or should we be throwing things at them? And that uncertainty meant that people, Native American people, historically had made sure that they would have gifts that they could provide to people who were their neighbors when they encountered them, neighboring tribes when in the places where the two areas the tribes are in when they come up against each other. Gift giving is the first part of any interaction unless they're actually fighting. And so the French picked up on this as a way to show good faith. And so, whenever the delegations from Native American tribes came to their trading forts, which is usually an annual thing, before there's any business transacted, the French would give gifts to their visitors from these Native American tribes. The English, for example, later, who were very practical, later saw this sort of thing and said, well, that's dumb. Why are you wasting your money? These people are here to do business with you. Why give them stuff first? You're just hurting your leverage. But the French had picked up on something that honestly very few English people ever understood, which is that if you start your business transactions after you've already identified yourself as a friend, after you've already identified yourself as someone who understands cultural values, then your relationship will be much smoother. And as a result, later on, when there are more conflicts in North America that relate to the different colonial groups fighting with each other, the French can almost always rely on help from their Native American neighbors in a way that the British almost never can. Because the English, they're going to have a different kind of relationship with the people living in this land already. and the French, who are more lightly settling, more focused on trade, but also who, in some cases at least, had a better cultural understanding. The French can rely on these neighbors of theirs more as allies than most of the other Europeans could. So um, we'll hear more about the French and their settlements, particularly as they start to bump up against the English neighbors who are coming soon. But one other, besides my friends in New Sweden, one other that's worth mentioning is going to be the Netherlands. Partly, I mentioned this to give you an idea that yes, just about every country in Europe is trying to get in on this colonial business. Everybody wants their piece. Again, I would guess if I was to ask most of you to name all the countries in Europe, unless you're a World Cup fan and you think, oh, the Netherlands, they always look so good and then they fold in the quarters or whatever. Um, other than that, it might take you a while to come up with the Netherlands. But in the early 1600s, the Netherlands was a rising country, an important power, and they had a big moment which didn't last that long, in part because they're pretty small and they couldn't really sustain it for too long. But the French, or sorry, the Netherlands, which had previously been dominated by the Spanish, were able to pull themselves away and gain independence from the Spanish after a series of wars about religion that we're going to talk about in another context soon. Um, they were able to do that and establish themselves independent and also as Protestants, and then began to try to make a go of it in this complicated world. In the early 1600s, they had some successes. A lot of important things about business and trade were developed by the Dutch that then later people like the British picked up on and ran with. But as they're trying to kind of plant their flag in the world, the Dutch decided that they also, like the other bigger European powers, were trying to get into this colonization idea in the New World. By 1609, when they're looking for somebody to do some exploring for them, I guess they ran out of Italians because in 1609 they hired an English guy named Henry Hudson. Hudson, hired by the Dutch government, traveled around the eastern seaboard. A lot of the places that some of these earlier explorers had already been through, but tried to hone in on and get a little bit more information about some parts of the eastern seaboard that maybe there hadn't been as much attention paid, and see if there were some other goodies that could be found there. He traveled up from what's now New York City up the Hudson River, which, yes, he named after himself. He's a pretty modest guy, hoping that he could figure out that it would be a way to get through North America. That didn't happen. There's no such thing that exists. Well, maybe after global warming, we'll have ways to get around North America. That's a scary thought. But after he failed in finding a way to get through North America, he went back to his Dutch bosses and he said, listen, there isn't actually, as far as I can tell, in that part of North America, a way to cut through. But what I did find, and I did plant the Dutch flag there on your behalf, I did find this very deep and navigable river that goes pretty far into the interior and might be a good jumping off place for you guys. And so, in the decade or so that followed, the Dutch followed up on his early exploration, and by the mid 1620s were ready to establish a colony in that part of the mid Atlantic, a colony that had its administrative headquarters at the bottom of the Hudson River, where it flows out into ultimately into the Atlantic Ocean. New Amsterdam was established where New York City is, where Manhattan is. It was not purchased from the Indians for $24 worth of trinkets and beads. That's a myth. Um, but the Dutch set up their administrative headquarters there and established it, named it after their capital city, and established that as sort of their HQ, and then worked their way up the Hudson River, establishing forts as well as large agricultural plantations. Rich Dutch families settled along the coastal region on either side of the Hudson River. Some of them were there for centuries. Some of their descendants wound up as Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, two of the most important presidents of the 20th century. The Dutch are big players in that part of the region long after they were not really Dutch anymore. at the very, very tip of the Hudson River, sorry, the height of the Hudson River. Today, that's Albany, which is the state capital of New York. That was established in the 1620s as a fort. It was called Fort Orange, named after, well, I'm wearing orange, named after the color that we associate with the Dutch, which is itself named after a place in the Netherlands. And so, there are people whose name is Orange because they're from Orange. So Fort Orange is named after this place from back home. That fort was the center of the Dutch trading efforts with their Native American neighbors. Although their colony was never anything like the size of the French colony, what they're trying to do is something similar to what the French had done. They established that trading fort at the top of the Hudson River, and then they invited all the nearby tribes to trade with them and established a pretty successful network of trade. There's an important confederacy of Native American tribes, roughly the Great Lakes and upstate New York region of today. The Iroquois tribes, those are the people that they are trying to work with because they're the most important and most powerful, and therefore the best trading partners. And they had some success. So you have the administrative headquarters, New Amsterdam, where Manhattan is today. The Netherlands is a small place. There aren't really that many people there. And New Netherlands, as they call their colony, brilliantly, New Netherlands was a colony that always struggled from the beginning to find settlers because they're drawing from a fairly small population back home. The result was that although Fort Orange was fairly Dutch and these agricultural establishments along the Hudson River were pretty Dutch, New Amsterdam, uh, because they desperately needed people to help them out, New Amsterdam pretty much opened up its doors to almost anybody. And so by the middle 1600s, there is probably no place in North America and maybe no place in the world quite as cosmopolitan as New Amsterdam was. There's dozens of different languages being spoken there, multiple religions and different branches of Christianity. Also, the first Jewish synagogue in the New World is established there. If you like to think of, as I do, of New York City as exciting, as cosmopolitan, as sort of the crossroads of the world, it's good to know that that seems like that was something that was fated to be true from its very origins. In the 1600s, it was a place where people from all walks of the world came together and they did their best to live and work amongst each other. It was a complex and an interesting place. However, by 1664, the Dutch colony, which had never really been that successful, it was always pretty small, never a big money maker, had had lots of internal problems. By 1664, the English showed up and, without firing a shot, pretty much took over the New Netherlands colony and made it part of their English colonies. There was a little bit of resistance from the governor, the Dutch governor, but for the most part, the people in the colony were willing to just give up. The English were pretty nice about it after all was said and done. They told the Dutch settlers of the colony, we're going to change the name and we're going to change the official language and we're going to impose some laws, but you guys can continue to have the churches you've already had. You can keep the same land that you've always had. We're not going to force you to speak English. For generations, there were people, especially in upstate New York, who continued to speak Dutch on a regular basis. The English essentially said, we're in charge, but you can continue to do what you want. And as a result, the Dutch settlers pretty much allowed this to happen. There was limited resistance at the time, and there won't be a heck of a lot of backlash against that. There'll be one moment where they rose up, but other than that, for the most part, the Dutch allowed this to happen. So that's because this Dutch settlement was never that big. They roughly, New Netherlands includes the modern day state of New York, including Long Island and North Jersey, basically. They eventually they take over New Sweden, which is roughly Pennsylvania, at least the Philly area, and then on the other side of the river, like Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Um, but it was never a big colony. And then the English came and took over. Now, for the English to come and take over, that indicates that something big had changed. Because in my last discussion, I said that in the late 1400s, the English had hired this Italian guy whose name they can't pronounce, and he did some exploring, but they didn't really follow up on it that much because they had other things going on. And honestly, nobody really would have thought of England as a big colonial power on the rise in the 1500s. And yet, here in the 1600s, they're a big enough deal that they not only are going to set up colonies, but they're going to boot out somebody else from their colonies. All right, well, that it turns out is going to be the story of the next couple of weeks, because those English settlers are going to establish colonies that will become the building blocks that will turn into the United States of America. These other colonial empires still existed. In some cases, will be taken over or pushed out by the English and then later the Americans. Although, of course, the existence of millions of Spanish speaking people on either side of the more or less in our heads Spanish American border is an indication of the importance of the Spanish heritage to our country that we should not forget. And similar in a small way for Dutch and French and other Europeans who colonized here, and their descendants are still here in some numbers. Okay, but when we pick up next time, that will be the discussion. We'll be talking about the English colonists, why they came here, their initial lack of success, and then when we work into next week, we'll start to fill in that story with different kinds of English colonies. Thanks for your time today. I hope that after you're done with both of today's lectures, that I can get a quick email from you where you can just tell me in a couple sentences what were some of the most important things that we talked about. I just want to make sure that everybody is with me. I know that we are in weird circumstances. I'm sitting down in my basement talking to a computer screen for like 3 hours. Um, the other lectures will, well, we'll see how they go. Um, they'll be better. I'll do my best. I'm trying. Send me any questions. Definitely write comments on the YouTube site once I get these up on YouTube, and let me know how things are going. Thanks very much, and I will talk to you again soon.